the start of the pandemic, many daycare centers closed down, leaving teachers unemployed and kids to stay home as their parents worked remotely. Some teachers, like Chelsea Rudder of Seattle, decided to watch some of the toddlers at her own home, giving her a sense of job security that few had at the beginning of 2020. However, Rudder's employer, Bright Horizons, one of the largest for-profit childcare centers in the country, requested that any of the families who hired her for help outside of the daycare pay them a $5,000 replacement fee.
Despite the fee, Rudder worked for a few of the families, and Bright Horizons actually never went after them to get that money. But she's now suing the company in a class action lawsuit, arguing that the placement fee illegally suppressed workers' wages. Joining us now to discuss is labor reporter at HuffPost, Dave Jamieson. Welcome, Dave.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So this is very interesting. Probably, most people listening to this will say, okay, that the daycare provider should absolutely be free to, make some extra cash or any cash at all during the pandemic by providing exactly that service, a very needed service when actual daycare centers were not available. So what was the rationale that this employer? They were going to charge. Who were they? Yeah, lay this out for us. Were they going to charge the fee for, and then they didn't follow up on that?
Sure. So when you enroll in Bright Horizons, and I don't know if this is for everyone, but it was true for me, frankly. I have two little kids, and I agreed to this clause when I enrolled in Bright Horizons. You agree to pay a $5,000, essentially a poaching fee. So you, as a client, if you're going to hire away a worker to work for you at home, like probably the nanny, you're supposed to pay this $5,000. They call it a placement fee. It's essentially a poaching fee. Obviously it's there. It functions as a non-compete agreement, right? Although instead of telling the worker they can't go anywhere, what it's doing is telling the client, well, you can hire, but you're going to get socked with this really huge fee. And so I think what it does is it very likely discourages people from trying to hire away workers, which at the end of the day is going to suppress job offers and ultimately probably keep wages down.
Here's what I don't understand, though. So she sort of the worker, Chelsea Rudder. So she had these kids, took care of them, was presumably paid for it. The parents were not actually didn't have to pay the $5,000 replacement fee. So who's part of the class action lawsuit? Like, she got the money from the parents. They didn't have to pay the poaching fee. So who was harmed here?
So her argument is that just by the existence of the clause, by it being there, and this applies to non-competes in general as well. Like, we don't know. Bright Horizons didn't answer any questions for me. I don't know if they routinely go after people for this. But even if they don't, by virtue of its being there, by somebody noticing it, by parents seeing it when they enroll there, it's going to make them less likely to try to poach a worker. And I mean, that was true for me. I was aware the clause was there when I enrolled. And so that's going to make somebody less likely to try to poach a worker, even if you don't know sort of if they're going to go after you for it, or maybe you even don't know if it's enforceable. And I think in a lot of states, this clause would not be enforceable. Chelsea Rudder argues, and she's suing under Washington State, has a pretty aggressive recent law that reins in the use of non-competes. And, that's only supposed to apply to a worker if they make at least $100,000 or more. These are daycare workers. They don't make anywhere near that. Chelsea was making around $20 an hour. So that's around $40,000 salary. So the purpose of the law is to discourage employers from trying to put these clauses in their contracts.
So what is the status of the lawsuit right now?
So it's a proposed class action. It was just filed. I'm sure they're hoping they'll get certified as a class action, and that other workers will join on. We saw this kind of infamous case was Jimmy John's, a sandwich shop that was using non-competes, and I think a lot of employers probably put these sorts of clauses in there. it's like boilerplate, right? I think a lot of companies don't see much harm in putting it in there, except maybe they'll get sued and have to pull it out eventually. I think a lot of them just put it in there because they don't see much downside to it, and it's going to create less competition for their workers. With daycare, as we said at the top here, when the pandemic hit, I as a parent, I saw this in real time, like the stock of nannies shooting up. I was hearing anecdotes on the playground of people getting poached, having to raise wages significantly, $5,000 or $10,000. And I think, this sort of agreement is there to prevent that from happening.
Right. So that's my question. I guess this is maybe a stupid question, but in a fight between a for-profit daycare center and a nanny, right, who's making $20 an hour, it's very clear who the good guy is. But in a for-profit nanny center, daycare center that serves maybe less wealthy clientele who can't afford a private nanny, right? I mean, you kind of want the best teachers not to be easily poached because there's a lot of low-income parents who are, I'm sure you couldn't have afforded to poach her and have her work at home full time. Even paying just $20 an hour, it's a lot of money. So in a way, it sort of makes it a bit more complicated, no?
Yeah, I think you're totally right. The nature of these agreements is they're going to help certain parties and they're going to hurt others when you have non-compete agreements. In this case, obviously, the people who are going to be helped by it are certainly the daycare provider here, Bright Horizons, but also, probably indirectly families who are enrolled at that center because those workers are going to be less likely to get poached away. And so the costs will be held down. If you can hold down the labor costs, you can hold down the tuition, but there's inevitably going to be parties who get hurt. And I think, the workers could be hurt by this, certainly by not being given better offers and their wages being held down. And also it would hurt anyone who might want to hire one of these women to nanny for them. So there's going to be people who win and there's going to be people who lose.
Yeah, I think if they had tried to, enforce the anti-poaching element of this during the pandemic against someone who is, not able to provide the service in the school, and then they were still enforcing it, I think that would have been really reprehensible. So I guess at least they didn't do that. Like you said, beyond that, it does start to get a little complicated because you're right. It's that sort of anti-compete clause is good for some people, bad for other people. I guess you can say I'm not going to go work for a place that has a non-compete clause. I'll find some place that doesn't, and et cetera. But maybe the choices are more limited that, or maybe it's very routine to require it. Obviously, that's a clause that is not unique to this field whatsoever. I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, I had some people, on Twitter saying, that they agreed with Bright Horizons putting this clause in there, essentially arguing in their terms, you shouldn't be able to get a free look at the talent. If you want to hire them, you should have to pay. Well, what I would say to that is, kind of where do you draw the line? You use the Jimmy John's example. If I go in and the guy in Jimmy John's makes me a terrific sandwich and I want to hire him to work at Dave's sandwich shop, I don't think we'd say that I shouldn't, that I'm getting a free look at the talent and I shouldn't be able to hire that guy away. Right. So, as we said, it's there's people who are going to get helped by this and there's people who are going to get hurt. And I think in this case, very likely the people at the top of the list to possibly be harmed by this are the low-wage daycare workers.
Well,
yeah.
Go ahead, Batya.
Oh, I was going to say, it would be one thing if they were putting the onus of the non-compete clause on the workers, but I think it's actually very interesting to put it on the parents, which makes it just adds another layer of complication here. You could imagine a world in which they're saying if you as a worker, somebody who has much less money and protection, go and work for somebody else, we're going to come after you for $5,000. But if they're saying, no, we're going to go after a parent for stealing a worker who's working for many families and hoarding them for their own kids, I think that's a little bit more justifiable.
Well, and also it's the school or Bright Horizons would have to then sue the parents, right? Like, let's say this happened under normal circumstances. They hire they like the preschool teacher. They're like, okay, we want to hire you just to, be our in-home preschool teacher for our kids. So the preschool teacher quits and does that job. Like, Bright Horizons isn't the state, it's not a law. They can't have the family arrested for doing that. They'd have to say, hey, you owe us $5,000, and then the family will say, screw you, we don't have to pay that, or we're not enrolling our kid there anymore. And so then they would have to sue them to make them for like a contract infringement, right? But it'd be their contract between the family, the family who had an enrolled kid in the school and the school, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So this would be, if they wanted to, if it would be if I hired a worker away to work in my house, they would have to come after me. Not the worker. That's essentially how this works. It sort of functions like a no poaching clause, which is like a little different than a traditional non-compete. No poaching is to like where all employers would essentially agree not to hire certain workers, right? This is aimed at other potential employers, families. And so we've seen a lot of these no poaching agreements too, notably in fast food, in the world of fast food, where sort of like where Dunkin' Donuts franchisees would agree not to hire workers away from one another, right? Because if I run a Dunkin' Donuts, like the best person I could hire is like someone who was a shift manager at a different Dunkin' Donuts and like really knows that world. And so the idea of the no poach is to kind of eliminate that sort of competition. And we know from studies that like when they are in effect that they suppress the wages. This happened in Washington State. Some economists did a study. When the state started trying to eliminate these sorts of agreements, they saw that wages went up. When you controlled for everything else, wages went up 3%. Once these franchisees weren't doing no poach agreements anymore. So we know that it does, even though we don't know how often it's enforced. And I think, frankly, I think from a PR perspective, it'd probably be a little crazy for Bright Horizons to be really going after families over this. Mm-hmm. But we do know that just by virtue of their existence, that they can have a real world effect on pay.
Well, Dave Jamieson, thank you so much for joining us to discuss. Thanks for walking us through this.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And we'll be back in just a minute.